She was 14 years old when the officials came to measure her wrists. They checked her teeth, her posture, the natural scent of her skin. Her mother stood behind her and was not permitted to speak. 3 hours later, the girl had a new rank and no way home. The Chinese Imperial Concubine system ran for over 2,000 years without interruption. It selected women the way a ministry selects grain for storage. It housed them, cataloged them, and largely forgot about them. Most of them never spoke to the emperor even once. Most of them grew old inside the same walls they entered as teenagers. The system was not exceptional in Chinese history. It was the expected and entirely ordinary infrastructure of imperial rule. This is what that life actually cost the women who lived it. Part 1. How the selection actually worked. The selection process during the Qing dynasty ran every 3 years without exception. Officials traveled to Manchu bannerman families and compiled lists of eligible daughters. Eligible meant between 13 and 17 years old with no physical defects. Families caught hiding a listed daughter faced criminal prosecution under imperial law. The girls were transported to Beijing and presented at court for inspection. The journey itself could take weeks depending on where the family was located. Officials examined their teeth, their hands, the proportions of their facial features. They also assessed something that almost no historical account mentions directly. The girls were evaluated on the natural fragrance of their bodies. A girl whose natural scent was deemed unpleasant was dismissed immediately. She had no recourse and no explanation was given to her family. A biological trait she had never thought about determined the rest of her life. The girls who passed initial inspection faced additional rounds of assessment over several days. Each round was more detailed and more invasive than the one before it. Most were sent home before the final selection was made. Being sent home was considered the fortunate outcome by every family involved. The girls who returned home could marry and build ordinary lives. The girls who remained entered the Forbidden City and the gate closed behind them. They were assigned ranks within a formal hierarchy of 8 distinct levels. Most entered at the lowest level with no guarantee of ever rising. Their rank determined their quarters, their food, their attendance, and their visibility. It also determined whether the emperor would ever learn their name at all. Some women spent their entire time in the palace without being formally introduced to him. They existed within the system as numbers rather than as people with identities. The hierarchy was not ceremonial in any sense at all. It was a material reality that shaped every hour of every day inside those walls. Part 2. The tablet system and the arithmetic of invisibility. The process by which an emperor summoned a concubine was entirely administrative. Each evening, a eunuch presented a lacquered tray to the emperor after dinner. The tray held small ivory plaques engraved with names and rank designations. The emperor turned over the plaque of whichever woman he wished to summon. The selected woman was then bathed, inspected, and wrapped in a red blanket. She was carried to the imperial bedchamber rather than allowed to walk. The carrying prevented any possibility of concealing a weapon on her person. She was removed from the chamber before dawn and escorted back without ceremony. If the emperor wished to acknowledge the encounter, he informed an official recorder. A silver bracelet was placed on the concubine's wrist to mark the summoning. If no acknowledgement came within a prescribed period, the encounter was administratively erased. Any pregnancy resulting from an unacknowledged encounter could be terminated by palace officials. The emperor's formal recognition was the only thing that made a child legitimate. Without it, the child had no existence within the imperial record. This was not an informal arrangement, but a documented and enforced administrative procedure. For most concubines, the plaque was never turned over at all. Emperors developed strong preferences and returned to the same women repeatedly across years. A woman could spend 4 decades inside the Forbidden City without a single summons. She would grow old in the same compound she had entered as a girl. She would die there without ever speaking meaningfully to the man whose name defined her existence. There are surviving records of women who tracked the years by the change of seasons. They wrote about watching the same courtyard tree lose its leaves year after year. They wrote about the silence that settled in once they understood the plaque would not be turned. Part 3. The Invisible War Inside the Walls. The inner palaces of the Forbidden City were not peaceful places. Thousands of women competed for one scarce and entirely untransferable resource: That resource was the personal attention of a single man. The competition produced methods of harm that left almost no visible evidence. Poisoning through scented objects was a documented tactic across multiple dynasties. Rivals would arrange for adulterated items to be placed in a favored woman's quarters. Poisoned sachets, contaminated incense compounds, and treated fabrics were introduced near her living space. The intention was not immediate death, but gradual deterioration over weeks or months. Fertility and physical health could be undermined through sustained and invisible exposure. The palace culture of elaborate fragrance use made this method nearly impossible to trace. Miscarriage could be induced through compounds administered without the target woman's knowledge. A pregnancy was a direct competitive threat to every other woman in the system. Not all rivals chose to respond to that threat through patience. Accusations of witchcraft were deployed as political weapons with devastating regularity. A woman accused of using supernatural arts to manipulate the emperor faced immediate investigation. The investigations were overseen by the empress or the emperor's mother. If either of those women had already decided the outcome, the process was a formality. The accused woman had no right to present evidence or call witnesses in her defense. She could be demoted, confined, or executed based entirely on the word of her accusers. Execution was documented but relatively rare across the system as a whole. Far more common was a slow administrative disappearance achieved through sustained demotion. Some concubines were confined to dedicated punishment halls with no defined release date. They remained in the palace records as alive, but ceased to exist within its social world. The palace absorbed these disappearances without registering them as unusual or noteworthy events. Women who had been vibrant participants in palace life simply stopped appearing in any record. The system had no mechanism for acknowledging what it had done to them. Part 4. What happened when the emperor died? The death of an emperor did not release his concubines from the palace. It made their confinement substantially more restrictive than it had been before. Women who had produced sons gained reflected status through those sons in the new reign. A concubine whose son ascended the throne could become Empress Dowager with real political power. This happened rarely enough that it should be understood as the extreme exception. For the majority, the emperor's death meant transfer to a permanent mourning compound. They shaved their heads as a mark of prescribed grief. They wore mourning robes for periods that extended across years. They were expected to spend the remainder of their lives in religious observance. Remarriage was forbidden regardless of how young she was when he died. Departure from the palace complex was forbidden regardless of circumstance. In earlier dynasties, the practice of burying concubines with a deceased emperor was standard. The Xuanding emperor ordered the deaths of several of his concubines upon his own death in 1435. The women involved reportedly wept throughout the final meal that preceded their execution. One account records that a concubine named Lady Han collapsed and had to be carried to the chamber. The practice was officially discontinued in the Ming and Qing periods, but isolated cases continued. The women who survived into new reigns were moved to increasingly marginal sections of the palace. Their attendance decreased over years as resources were redirected toward the living court. Their names disappeared from the active record while they were still alive. They were present in the palace physically, but absent from the world that the palace cared about. Some of them lived for 30 or 40 more years in this condition of official invisibility. Part 5. What the system produced and what it erased. The Imperial concubine system operated formally until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. Over its full history, it processed hundreds of thousands of women across multiple dynasties. The historical record preserved almost none of their individual names or stories. The records that survived were administrative rather than personal in nature. They recorded rank assignments, summoning tallies, and disciplinary outcomes. They did not record what the women thought, feared, or hoped for. Some women left behind diaries and poems that survived in fragmentary form. They described watching seasons change through courtyard windows across decades of waiting. They described the experience of growing old without acknowledgement or purpose. They described a specific kind of silence that settled in once hope was fully exhausted. A small number of women navigated the system with exceptional skill and genuine effect. Empress Dowager Cixi entered the palace as a concubine of very low rank. She eventually controlled the Chinese imperial government for nearly 50 consecutive years. She was singular enough that her story consumed the mythology of the entire institution. Most people who know her name do not know the names of the women who surrounded her. The women whose tablets were never turned over left behind almost nothing. They had no names in the record and no dramas made about their particular silence. The girl whose wrists were measured at 14 entered a gate that closed permanently behind her. She was surrounded by thousands of others in exactly the same position. She waited for a plaque to be turned that was never turned. The gate was entirely real and the walls around it were entirely real. The waiting lasted for years and sometimes for entire lifetimes. The rest of it was considerably harder than anything that has ever been filmed about it.